Unless you've been living under a rock for over the past couple of years, you would know that the state of college sports has been turned on its head. This is because one of the most prominent conferences in the game, the Pac-12, has gone bye-bye. The ramifications of this are going to last for years, including what may have been dubbed as the age of super conferences. I personally would not call it that, but the remaining power conferences are now significantly larger, and most are now dealing with the issue of siphoning their athletes across the entire country over any given weekend. Now, while it's cool to see all of these new matchups, are we sure this is going to work? Because while the major sports schools such as Washington, Oregon, and USC will be more than fine shipping their football and basketball players across the country, how about these schools that might not care about their athletic programs as much, such as Cal Berkeley or Stanford, who can compete both financially and athletically? But are these athletes fine traveling thousands of miles a month while also facing an incredibly rigorous academic schedule? Or what about these schools like Oregon State and Washington State that just aren't large enough to be added to any conference across the country, but are still large enough to be considered as a power school? These are questions that have to be considered, especially since there is now not a single power conference west of Texas, at least not right now. Let me introduce you to the Mountain West Conference, who in my opinion is the most interesting of the Group of 5 conferences. The Group of 5 is, well, a group of 5 conferences that are large enough to compete at the highest level of football, which is the FBS division, but still can't light a candle to teams from the largest conferences, at least most of the time. Although the Mountain West is typically considered a G5 conference, or a Group of 5 conference, their teams have lately seemed more than capable of standing toe-to-toe with the power conferences. An example of this can be found in the 2024 March Madness tournament, where 6 teams from the Mountain West were selected to compete in that tournament. But we'll talk about that later. I'm not arguing that this conference is at Power 5 status, but to say that it's just like the other Group of 5 conferences would be a lie. As in recent years, this conference has more than separated itself from the rest of its Group of 5 prodigies and has gone on to bridge the gap between the two levels of conferences. And because of the most recent conference realignment, I believe there exists a path for this conference to eventually gain power status, filling the void left by the Pac-12 as the new king of the West. Now, let's not waste any time and get started with the reasons. But before we look at anything else, let's do a quick recap of the history of the conference and the teams that comprise it. And I mean quick. If you want to see any in-depth history, I'm sure Deluxe will set you up or something. I'm pretty sure a good chunk of you guys already watch his stuff. The Mountain West isn't that old of a conference, at least compared to most other conferences. It got its beginnings back in the late 90s, when the Southwest Conference merged with the Big 8 to form the Big 12. When they did this, they left out some teams. This led TCU, SMU, and Rice to defect towards the WAC. That WAC. This was also right when the WAC added Tulsa, UNLV, and San Jose State. This buffed the WAC towards 16 teams, which is huge for 90 standards. However, the Super Conference didn't last long, as there were tensions between the new members, causing a meeting in the Denver International Airport between the presidents of BYU, Utah, Air Force, Colorado State, and Wyoming. They decided that it would be best to create a new conference that is now the Mountain West. These same schools, along with UNLV, New Mexico, and San Diego State, would comprise the initial members of the conference. They would then add TCU, Boise State, Fresno State, Nevada, San Jose State, Utah State, and Hawaii as a football-only member, while eventually losing Utah, TCU, and BYU. Recently, they've been relatively unaffected by the recent conference realignment. However, this may change very soon. See, I'm going to start by comparing the Mountain West with the rest of the Group of 5 conferences. Now let's start simply with football. Now with this argument, I'd argue that the football in this conference is the weakest part of my argument. Even though they are one of the better conferences out of the G5, they aren't the top dog, at least for now. Although, they're very close to this marker. They are ranked second in average attendance with an average attendance of 23,656 people per stadium per game. Meanwhile, the American has an average attendance of of 24,364 people. This information is of last year's data for next year's teams. So this is an American with Army and without SMU. These numbers are close and still leave the other conferences in the dust. It's important to add that the Mountain West can be significantly higher, just with a couple of fixes. First of all, Hawaii is their football-only member, and severely lags behind the rest of the teams in attendance due to their stadium. This stadium right here. Obviously, with a high school stadium, the numbers aren't even close to being with the rest of the teams, at almost 5,000 under the next lowest team, weighing down the entire conference. If Hawaii was factored out, then the Mountain West would be first, at 24,783. And if you want to factor in both Washington State and Oregon State as half members, that would further increase that amount. But those two teams are an entirely different bag of worms. The point is that the Mountain West can still be dominant in football very soon despite their current situation. Now we move on to basketball, where they have been much more successful. As I pointed out earlier, this conference had 6 teams in the tournament, tied for the third most. That includes all conferences, including the Power 5. That team that they were tied with was the Big Ten. That sounds weird saying out loud. Although only one of their teams made it to the Sweet 16 this time, that same team made it to the championship the year before, and lost this year to the team that won it all. Point is, basketball is their strongest sport right now, and it isn't even close. In fact, they may seem indistinguishable from the Big Six conferences in that sport. So if this conference can improve slightly at football, should they be deemed as the newest power conference? Maybe. Before I give my final opinion, I want to look at one more thing. TV markets. This may be this conference's secret strength. Let's start in Hawaii, where they are the only university that plays there in that entire time zone. There's no Maui State in the ACC, making the Mountain Conference completely dominant there. But even in these zones with more than one team, they may have some advantage. They have 5 teams in the Pacific time zone, making them the conference with the most teams in that region, while the Big Ten, the next highest, has 4. Finally, the conference has 6 teams in the Mountain time zone, once again making them the most representative conference in that region. These aren't completely dominant numbers, especially considering the size of the universities, but they still mean something. Networks are still going to find it appealing that the Mountain West, despite not having a single team in 2 of the 5 time zones hosting college football, has the greatest number of teams in the other 3. I feel as if this number of teams in these time zones may have some value towards TV providers. Obviously, the Big 10 and the Big 12 will be much more popular in their respective regions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Mountain West still can't be viable as the second most watched conference in that region. Is the Mountain West worthy of Power 5 status now? No. It's just too small right now. But with the right moves, it can be soon. In my opinion, the Mountain West could have several things happen to make it deemed as a power conference. The easiest is that it falls under a similar status as the Big East in basketball. I think this could happen if the conference continues its basketball prominence that has kind of held for the past couple of years. Then it will slowly be deemed as a power conference in that sport. But for football, things aren't going to be as simple. Another thing that would help is Washington State and Oregon State eventually electing to join the conference full time. These events are at least somewhat likely to happen, as they already have a scheduling agreement with those 2 teams. The second thing that would benefit the Mountain West is if the ACC collapses. Many think it will, I personally don't. However, if it did, then that would send a plethora of teams in the Mountain West's way, primarily Stanford, UC Berkeley, and SMU. And if they get those teams instead of the Big 12, who will probably be looking elsewhere in the remnants of the ACC, then they're in a good spot. It might also be likely that these schools will eventually migrate to the conference anyway because of their proximity. Lastly, they will want to find a way to grab a few specific schools in their reach, specifically Memphis, the top group of 5 school outside of the Mountain West, or even some of the larger FCS schools like South Dakota State or Gonzaga. That may sound underwhelming, but there could be a chance that South Dakota State is extremely similar to James Madison and competes in year 1 as a FBS school, or that Gonzaga can hold their own as a non-football member. In a perfect world for the Mountain West, they may be deemed as a power conference with their current members, as well as Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, UC Berkeley, SMU, Memphis, South Dakota State, and Gonzaga as a non-football member. What do you think of this 20-team conference? Would you consider that a power conference? Or can the Mountain West get to power status in another way? Share in the comments below. And if you like this video, maybe you could slip a tiny little click on that subscribe button. Or maybe you just want to comment and talk about how I said prodigy instead of protege 3 minutes into the video. That's okay too, I guess. But anyway, thank you for watching and have a great day.